most original and creative talent in our business. Would you welcome Mr. Orson Welles?
Ladies and gentlemen, Orson Welles again, come to call for another visit.
Good evening. This is Orson Welles.
Stay tuned.
Right after this episode.
For our discussion.
This is Orson Welles speaking, and this is the radio program that gives you a radio. A Lear 5-tube table model for every letter we can use. This being 15 minutes of commentary and opinion, we'd like it to be your commentary and your opinion as well as mine. Also, we spin a yarn occasionally, and our story today came in the mailbag from one of you who listened in. It well deserves the radio we're sending its author, and I think it deserves your attention. We'll get to it in just a minute.
To some people, the name Lear may be new, but that doesn't mean that the name Lear is new to radio. Far from it. Lear has been building radios since 1930, and they have been very special radios for aircraft. They have had to be built with the utmost consideration for perfection of design, precise engineering, and fine craftsmanship. Today, Lear is building home radios, and as you would expect, when this experience becomes linked with full knowledge of the latest advances and fine craftsmanship, these radios become instruments of rare excellence. One of the sensational developments you will find in Lear radios is a new method of recording. It's newer than wire recording. It records sound on tape. This has many advantages. Tape is less expensive, so it costs less to build up a library of recordings. And as Lear has developed it, tape does not have to be rewound. Whatever you record can be played back immediately. Sound on tape is just one of the new things you will find in Lear radios. It's just one of the reasons you will want your new radio to be a Lear. L-E-A-R. Now back to Orson Welles.
Here's that letter. It was January 13th, 1926. I'd just come back to the ranch from town. I drove the old Ford into the barn, turned off the key, and sat. I remember I was in kind of a daze. The words, 1 year at the most, kept going through my head. That was the verdict I'd heard that morning. 2 doctors and a specialist. 1 year at the most. As I sat there, I thought of a lot of things I should have done. Now there wasn't enough time. It was a tough break, and it would take some adjusting to, but life would go on just the same. I got out of the car. There were endless jobs I had to do on the ranch. I took my pruning shears and saw and went out into the orchard. At the top of the orchard was an old apple tree, twisted and scarred, full of rotten wood and borers. Something like me, I thought. I'd intended taking it out last year, but just never got around to it. Started sowing. Halfway through, I had to rest. 2 blue jays unmusically came to life and then were quiet. Everything was quiet. The fog rolled damply around me, and suddenly, in this gray stillness, the old tree groaned. Of course, it must have been the wind that moved the tree, yet the fog lay thick and still as ever. I started sawing again, a feeling of urgency coming over me. I must get this tree down quickly. The sweat broke out all over me, but I went on till the saw took its final bite, and the old tree shivered and stiffly rolled over to the ground. I was so tired I sat down on the stump to get my strength back. And I noticed the tree had fallen in such a position as to show 2 rotten holes in its trunk, and these holes seemed to be looking at me like the eyes of some unhappy hound. You shouldn't have cut me down. I could almost hear the old tree say it. I got up and went towards the house. I was sick of the old tree. When we burnt prunings in February, the old tree was still there. I hadn't had time to haul it away yet. March came, and I gave up all heavy work. Towards the middle of April, the rains cleared off, and a spell of real spring weather came. I thought I'd take a walk around the orchard and see how the buds were swelling. When I got to the top, I was surprised to see the old tree in full bloom. I'd never seen it, or any other tree for that matter, so covered with flower. I looked around and could not see another tree with any color showing. I sat down on the severed stump and observed the old tree. The 2 eyes still looked at me mournfully. I felt that this tree had something to tell me, and I found myself talking aloud to it. "Why don't you give up and die?" I said. "I cut you down, and still you bloom." The two eyes just stared. Darn the tree. I began to wish I'd never cut it down at all, at least not until the end of the year. I gave the tree a gentle pat and walked off, unaccountably miserable. Every day I straggled up to the top of the orchard to see how the old tree was coming along, and by May the blossoms were off, but a fine crop of leaves had arrived. To my amazement, I noticed that the blossoms had set and that the tree was covered with little apples. The stump had become my regular resting place by now. Every day I'd sit in the sun for half an hour or so and try to forget yesterday and tomorrow. I believe my chief concern at this time was to see when the old tree would give up the ghost, and which would be first, it or I. June was hot, and it was all I could do to get up to the stump, but I made it every day. Color came into the apples on the old tree a good 3 weeks before the rest of the orchard. The apples on it were smaller and of a golden color. I figured by the end of June, if the old tree held out, it would ripen the whole crop. On the 29th of June, I went up as usual. Every apple on the tree was a golden red. The old tree had done it. I sat down on the stump. "See here, old tree," I said, "maybe I cut you down too soon. For that, I'm sorry. But I would like to try some of your apples if you don't mind too much." I looked at the eyes. They seemed less mournful. In fact, they looked as if they were closing. This, I felt, was mute assent to my wish, so I got up and picked an apple from the nearest branch. I must have shaken the tree as I did so, for the supporting branches that held the old tree off the ground cracked and let it down with a rustling sigh. The rotten trunk caved in just below the eyes, closing them at last. As the tree had settled to the ground, every apple and every leaf had left the tree and lay around it, a red golden mantle, a tribute to the endless urge for life. I walked slowly away, the apple still in my hand. Before I reached the house, something had happened to me. I felt a new surge of strength. Suddenly, all the vast accumulation of knowledge of the followers of Hippocrates was as naught. That old tree had spoken to me at last. Rotten to the core, cut off from the soil, it had flowered, leafed, and fruited. In that moment, I knew that the urge of life had become strong again in me. Once again, the future beckoned with outstretched hands. I planted the seeds from the apple that day. Next spring, I planted a sturdy seedling outside my window. As I threw the last shovelful of dirt into the hole, I turned and faced uphill and lifted my hat to the old apple tree. Sincerely yours, Leland H. Noel. Well, Mr. Noel gets a Lear radio with my good wishes for the next 20 years. Now some news and opinions. The news is bad. In Washington today, we have the unlovely spectacle in the United States Senate of an ugly-minded little handful of so-called Democrats filibustering against democracy. If that word, democracy, means equality of opportunity, a permanent Fair Employment Practices Committee means a good firm step towards spelling it out. But look, just look what's happening. The Southern, quote, liberals, unquote, are shown up very, very badly. Claude Pepper, for instance, one of the chief orators of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, liked nothing better than to be vice president, but poor Claude dashed his hopes on the rocks by a lengthy pronunciamento against FEPC. Then there's Lister Hill of Alabama, probably the next majority leader, and you should have heard him ranting about what would happen to the nation if the FEPC came through. Both men have more than 4 years to run on their terms, and as one veteran Washington cynic put it to me the other day, they didn't have to demagogue. Claude and Lister could have stayed safely liberal for 3 more years and then backtracked in time for re-election. And so many of us hoped Senator Fulbright of Arkansas would become a real leader in the defense of democracy. But ridiculing FEPC last week, Fulbright described democracy as the rule of the mob. The men you and I elected to the Senate are confronted with greater problems than have ever faced men at any time in the whole long history of man. Our representatives are supposed to find a way of controlling atomic energy, of preventing World War III, which includes the immediate prevention of mass starvation in Europe and Asia, the sure way to world war and world tyranny. There's reconversion, and our senators are supposed to see that our soldiers come home, that they get homes to live in and clothes to wear and food to eat and jobs to do. But our senators have not had the opportunity for some time now to cope with any of these issues. If you haven't studied this current filibuster, you may share the popular belief that our senators are arguing the matter of fair employment practices for all Americans. Our senators are doing no such thing. Since January 17th, they've been considering the Senate Journal for that day. Our history books will say that every day since that day, quote, the Senate resumed consideration of Mr. Hoey's motion to amend the Journal of the Proceedings of the Senate of Thursday, January 17th, 1946, unquote, which is, of course, the purest parliamentary hanky-panky, a cheap trick to prevent a vote on FEPC, since there can be no cloture when the Senate is simply considering alleged errors in the Senate Journal. Overton of Louisiana says we'll make the Journal for that day a veritable work of art. Every day, thousands of people die of starvation. Every day, more atomic energy is harnessed for destruction. But every day is January 17th in the United States Senate. In Washington, the long, troubled Potomac rises and lowers on a scene of mounting chaos. Confusion multiplies like little rabbits. The president gets tough, then softens. He turns left, shudders, turns right, squirms, twists and twirls, and then stands still. No man gets his way. No plan gets a fair trial. Nobody's happy. And now we hear the president is going on a vacation. Where to? The moon? Where else can Harry Truman find a holiday? Now your attention, please, for an interesting announcement.
As we said before, Lear has been building fine radios for more than 16 years. Only aviators got them because they were special radios for aircraft. Now Lear is building home radios, and you'll be able to have a set for your home made with the same engineering foresight and the same precise manufacture. You'll find Lear home radios in a number of beautiful models, tastefully designed and made with the master craftsman's touch. Some include television. Some have the sound-on-tape recording. Some provide FM and world-scanning shortwave. And there'll be an entirely new remote tuning control which lets you tune in any station on the dial without leaving your easy chair. About the prices? Well, right there is a surprise. The finest radio phonograph console combination that has television and everything sells for about $500. And at the other end of the line, there's a good-looking, capable table model at $19.95. It won't be long now before these radios will be reaching your dealer, and you'll be able to hear them for yourself. We know you're going to agree that you get the most for every dollar you invest when you buy a radio that carries the name Lear. L-E-A-R. Now back to Orson Welles, whose views and opinions are his own and do not necessarily represent those of Lear Incorporated.
Every Sunday morning before sitting down at this microphone, I step into the newsroom here at the ABC studios for a last look at the tickers. There wasn't much cooking today. I was on my way out empty-handed, as a matter of fact, when I noticed a clip with the word that on Guernsey and the Channel Islands, at the comfortable age of 79, a notable storyteller of my youth and of my father's youth had breathed his last during the night. E. Phillips Oppenheim wrote over 100 novels, none of which will survive him by many printings, but more than any fictioneer, Mr. Oppenheim is responsible for the popular conception of the glamorous international spy. Well, personally, I've known several spies here and there about the world, and none of them were glamorous in the least. The professionals, who are, of course, the heroes and villains of the Oppenheim legends, are underpaid and live out the greater part of their lives in conditions of the meanest squalor. I remember one of these, a seedy old gentleman who was passing himself off as an anthropologist at the time, riding down with me in a smelly bus from Ceuta in the mountains of Spanish Morocco. We'd seen a good bit of each other during the past week, and, as is frequently the case with these gentlemen, we quickly ran out of permissible topics for conversation. He was reading. The book was an omnibus collection of the spy stories of E. Phillips Oppenheim. Well, I see my time's up. Thanks for letting me come to call, and please join me next time. Till then, speaking for my sponsors, the makers of Lear Radio, I remain, as always, Obediently yours.
This is the American Broadcasting Company.
Well, hello again. This is Buck Benny speaking. I'm joined by Kathy Fuller-Seeley and Vincent Longo as we present another one of our Orson episodes. This is an interesting one. He receives, at least according to him, I think this is probably true, I don't know, that he received this letter, and it is written by someone who wrote him in, and it's a story that they've written, and that becomes a big piece of this episode. And then there's but he covers a lot of ground towards the end. The beginning part is pretty much reading the person's letter. The story they've written is impactful to me. Being as folks know, I think that I just had a heart attack earlier this year, and you start thinking about your longevity and everything, and the fact that the writer in this story says that in I think it was 26 or 23 or something like that, they had 1 year left to live, and that's kind of what the story's somewhat about, and I found it to be a poignant story. And Orson, of course, does a beautiful job reading any story, whether it's biblical, whether it's somebody's creative writing that they do. He just does a fantastic job of that. So this is a interesting, good episode, a little different, a little breather from some of the other highly packed episodes, at least at the beginning. But then he starts packing stuff in at the end anyway. Let's go over to Vincent and find out what stood out for Vincent in this one.
Yeah, so like you said, Buck, this episode is kind of in two halves. The first one is not as dense. The second one is just as dense as you've come to expect and maybe love, hopefully, from Orson Welles. But the first one is this story. It's certainly not a veiled allegory. It is a little confusing, but it is beautiful. It's a beautiful story about this apple tree that this person who finds out they're dying, they cut down. Essentially, they're like, this tree is dying, I'm going to cut it down. But of course, the tree strangely buds new apples and sort of dies this glorious, beautiful death that inspires this person to live a fruitful life. Pun intended. It's really well read, and it's really well written in a way that I know we've sort of suspected that is Wells actually getting these letters. Is he not? There's no evidence why. I'm going to say that somebody actually submitted this. I don't know why. I mean, at first I thought this sounds kind of like, I thought it was going to be a suspense story, that Wells is known for doing and writing. We had that one Christmas episode, I think that was part of the Ever Sharp, where he basically makes a Christmas suspense story. It kind of begins that way because I thought the tree was going to be evil and weird and bad things were going to happen, but it ends up being not that at all. Sort of an introspective story about this person's life. But to me, it's unclear the takeaways of this story. I have some ideas. Kathy, I'm curious what you think, reflecting on age and health and death and all that kind of stuff. But Kathy, what do you think?
Well, I was curious. When I said hearing it, I go, well, I couldn't quite understand. I thought he had chopped down the tree. What is it doing, making leaves and buds and little apples? Although I was very happy for the tree. I was trying to say, is this a hopeful a vision? Because he talks about the endless urge for life. And once again, the future beckons with outstretched hands. This is a metaphor for finding hope in the post-war world. Well, the fact that just 6 weeks later, we'd be going ticking time bombs of imminent death for the whole world. But here, is it possible that after the huge destruction, that a world in pieces manages to rejuvenate itself in the endless search for life and community and beautiful little apples? So indeed, I was taken by its charm. A little bit confused I got caught up in, I thought this tree had been chopped down. But again, I wondered if it was sort of hope on a global level.
Well, I have that confusion every year, Kathy, as my wife goes and does her yearly pruning of things, because her idea of pruning and my idea of pruning are very different things. She leaves essentially like little stumps everywhere that is all that's left of something. but they always seem to grow back. And so it always it's hard to kill these things. I will swear some of the things are dead and are not coming back, and then they do. So that could be very similar to Orson's story here. I don't know.
Yeah, I took it less on a global level, but I do actually see I see how that works. For me, it was like, okay, so if we think of this person, they think they're dying, they're sort of depressed, not sort of, I understand they were very depressed.
Yes.
And then they cut down this tree because they think it's dying and they think that's the right thing to do, but it sort of has this last, almost poetic realism or magical realism, sort of last breath where it brings this beauty into the world. I mean, I saw two things. One is that Wells, even when he was in his 20s, was very interested in aging, being old. And so he's always sort of fascinated that far beyond his years. At the same time, like FDR just died. And so I was thinking, like, is this a reflection about how even when FDR knew he was dying, was really sick, he still tried to create something beautiful in the world, to give his last fruit, so to speak. And so I thought this maybe as like he thought this story really spoke to him in the sense of like, even when you don't have much time left or that you're sick, still do the best that you can to bring beauty into this world. And if you can live that way, because the one thing that I took out of this is like, yeah, there's the magic part about the fruit, but also there's the not magic part, which is like the person actually, when they realized they were dying, they stopped and they looked around and they just sat in the forest and they looked at the flowers and they looked at and they took the time just like, hey, can I eat your fruit? Like their whole life sort of changed in a way that made them reflect upon their own life. And to me, that was actually the beauty of this, is like, whether or not the magic part happened, I don't know, it's confusing, it's kind of weird, but it's still like caused this person to reflect on their own life. And, of course they end up living 20 years, but I was thinking like, honestly, again, if it's a real story, that this isn't how it would work, but I was like, actually it would be kind of a more interesting story to me if that person did die in a year, because it's like, but they were like, okay, I'm going to make this year the best that it can, either for me or for the people around me or whatever you can do. Because, we all have a finite amount of time and we all want to leave something beautiful in this world, however temporary. And of course, then he plants the seeds. That's where I think the global part might come into this, is like, FDR worked hard to, so his fruit could bear seeds that then, I could see that going, in that way. But I thought it very personal. Like, we just all want to try to plant something that comes back in the world, something that makes a mark. Yeah. If it is written by a random person, that's probably why it doesn't completely hold up in every part of it. But it could also have just been Wells on a train writing a random story and been like, I'm going to pretend to be Leland whatever.
Yeah, Leland H. Knoll, who has a very specific...
Well, also it makes you think, was he tempted to go punch some of the story up, and did he add some to it or change some to this person's story, or did he read it as is? I don't know. I mean, because we know Orson was a decent writer on his own as well, right? So
yeah, that's true.
And I can see him be tempted to punch it up a little bit, but who knows if that happened or
didn't the other story that because he's read two other stories that we've been like, did somebody really like that? Didn't one of the stories also have a name that was like Leland or Jedediah or something like that? Which, if Jedediah Leland from Citizen Kane, both of those names had to do with that character who was a writer, a critic, and all that stuff.
Right.
So I wonder if like he just goes to that as his pen name for his fake story. I have no idea. Who knows? But I'm sure people wrote beautiful stories. They didn't have to be professional writers. Fan fiction, much of which is garbage, but some of which is good, Yeah, exactly. So I'm sure somebody wrote good stories back then.
And I prefer to think of it that someone wrote it and sent it in. He just read it. That's great.
There you go.
And they got a radio out of the deal. What are you going to do?
I appreciate of this sort of run of commentaries that we're getting to listen to. It's a little like Jack Benny in that, gotta bring in Jack Benny, in that Benny and his writers strove to always be changing it up and to do something different every week. And so I appreciate we've gone in the stretch we're talking about most recently from a sort of elegy and a sad look back at a dying friend to who was the president, to this kind of study of hope for the future versus in just a couple weeks, it will be a true fear for the future and scaring.
Right.
Yeah.
About panic about all the terrible things that are happening. So I appreciate that he's using different metaphors and different pathways and different ways of doing his show every week instead of being the same old every week. So
yeah. And the fact that these shows were lost for so many years, so many of them, and to be able to bring them forth and have people enjoy them, probably more people enjoying them than ever before, other than when they were first aired, right? And in the case of the Eversharps, probably more people than have ever listened to the Eversharps because they weren't circulated very well, and they certainly weren't ever even aired on radio. So it's just nice to be able to share these with everyone, be able to have our little commentaries, our little discussions, and for people to think about them too. And I love the fact that so many of the folks that listen to these especially on YouTube, will post in the comments their thoughts on the episode and the things that touch them, and so that's great. So I encourage them to keep doing that. But yeah, and then after the letter portion of this, where they get into talk about the senators and things going on in politics and anything, was there anything that stood out of that part, Vincent, that you wanted to get into or anything? Or
Yeah. So, the next part, he talks about the filibuster, which has some great quotes. This is when, from my understanding, this is a more classical filibuster. When you think of a filibuster, somebody stands up and they read or they take all the time. My understanding is that's not how filibusters work today. Filibusters are like just an official action rather than like they go up and stand or do something asinine.
Goes to Washington.
Exactly, right. And so in this case, of course, the filibuster is great. They're debating the minutes of January 16th. And I love the quotes. I don't know if he makes them up, but he says they're quotes. "We will make this journal a work of art." And then Wells says, quote, "Every day, thousands of people die of starvation. Every day, more atomic energy is harnessed for destruction. But every day is January 16th in the Senate." Yes. I thought that was really, really poignant, really beautiful. It gets the weird idea of what a filibuster does, which is just a way to stop debate and votes. I've always found the filibuster to be kind of weird and problematic. I understand it's a strategy, but Wells, as you can clearly get in this, is not a fan of the filibuster, especially with things that he wants taken care of done, which in this episode, he more clearly gives his bullet point list of what he loves about politics and what he wants. He says it very clearly. The Senate needs to take care of the atomic bomb. The Senate needs to issue what will be called the Marshall Plan, which is the reconstruction of Europe to stop tyranny and world war. Essentially, fascism is what he's afraid of. And then we need the soldiers to come home. We need the economy to be better. They need to have jobs. They need to do whatever. Pretty much that. Add race, which he doesn't talk about too much in this episode, although there are parts of it. And there you go. That's every episode of the commentaries. He talks about some theme of those. But here he says, like, these are the main things that they need to take care of. But you know what they're talking about? January 16th. It's like Groundhog Day. So I really like that. The other thing that I wanted to just emphasize, some people will likely know this, but I was never, I was always confused about this until not that long ago, which is in these episodes, Wells is constantly complaining, actually rarely, about Republicans. Wells is a burning Democrat, but he mostly complains about Democrats. Truman, he in this episode, or it was the last one, I can't remember. He actually never refers to Truman by his name. He says Missouri. That's what he always says. Missouri's doing this. Missouri's doing that, to suggest he's not like a representative of the United States. But Wells constantly is complaining about Democrats, particularly Southern Democrats. And this is actually a snapshot of something that does not exist today: a strong Southern Democrat, because soon after this, they move over to the Republican Party. There's the Dixiecrat Party in 1948, which is pretty much a giant failure, but it does move the Democrats away from Democratic Party into the Republican Party. And that's basically what Wells's big thing is here. So a lot of, FDR's not complete popularity, but some of it was dependent on Southern Democrats. A lot of them were in support of his economic policies of the New Deal, but don't touch Jim Crow. Get away from Jim Crow. Stay away from Jim Crow. FDR played it political. He didn't try to, totally fight off Jim Crow, but Wells is pulling punches on Jim Crow at any moment that he can. And so he says, why aren't these Southern Democrats who hold powerful positions? He's like, one might be the vice president in the future. One will likely be the majority leader soon. Why couldn't you actually be liberal for 3 years and then just pretend like you weren't liberal and then, get voted in? Like, that's his big thing. And so we see this moment that, again, will lead to the fracturing of something we don't have anymore, really, which is powerful Southern Democrats. Go ahead.
Basically, it was LBJ coming in and doing the civil rights movement and the civil passing the civil rights bills and things
the last big
that had us.
Yep.
And
it even started with Truman, though.
They were going to lose the Southern Democrats for a generation, but I think they've lost them even up until today. So I mean, it was multi-generations that they lost them for or whatever. But just interesting how it shows, like you were saying, that he goes after Democrats, even though he's a Democrat. The Democrats have been eating their own for the last 75 years. So
there you go. But
and it continues to this day.
Yeah. Vincent, I think you're so right on about everything that Orson was saying. And here you even get race into it, because I believe this fair labor employment bill that the Southern Democrats are filibustering would have allowed more equal. I mean, had some. It was an early way of trying to get more civil rights protection. That they were using the power of filibuster to make sure that wasn't going to happen. So, but tell me now, on the other hand, what is this about spies? Why? What is this with catty old spies and E. Phillips Oppenheim?
Yeah.
That he's getting into and then runs out of time. So
yeah, he does. He's sort of like, it's like a last thing. He's like, he needs to go out of his way to commemorate this writer that even he admits is going to be completely forgotten, and frankly has. If you can, he has a Wikipedia page, but his Wikipedia, the key thing for me on like Wikipedia there is it has almost no links in it. Like, it doesn't link anywhere. He's got like a ton of books. None of them have their own pages. And yeah, so, Wells is a voracious reader. I've mentioned this several times on this podcast, but like, if you read his letters to just other people, he's like, send me more books, I need more books. I need to read more books. I don't know when he does it, but he just reads constantly. And apparently he loves this spy writer. And even the Wikipedia page says like, oh, his books were famous for just being incredibly easy to read. And that was about it. I was like, oh, okay. The other thing Wells mentions, which I thought was really interesting, is like how many spies he hangs out with. He's like, oh yeah, I hang out with spies all the time. I don't think he's wrong, weirdly enough. He's overplaying it a little bit, but he specifically mentions in Spain, which of course Wells was a part of, the anti-Franco, he did some media for them and all that kind of stuff. So I believe that. One interesting thing that I learned is soon he'll be doing Around the World in 80 Days, or Around the World, actually, what it was called, the Broadway musical. There were film portions of that, and there was this editor, Irving Lerner. I could be wrong in his name, but anyway, I researched him just on a whim. He also was an accused spy, a spy particularly for Russia. He was caught taking pictures of like nuclear related things. And he was the film editor for those sections. So it's very possible Wells actually did hang out with spies. But I love that he brought this up, because he basically says like, oh, a spy's life is actually really incredibly boring. And their life is so boring that they read this guy's spy stuff because of how much more exciting it is. It made me think of like, okay, you watch James Bond and, he gets the women, he drinks the martinis, he saves the day. I'm sure a spy's life is actually pretty not that fun.
Well, it's so interesting how we know Ian Fleming, because of James Bond, because of all the films. Had he been like this writer and they made no films from his work, Woody and Fleming be a name that's as readily known? I don't think so. Without
They
the
did make
long
films of
program.
this guy's. That's the thing that surprised me. So that's the one thing that's clear on his Wikipedia page. Again, this is as far as I did the research, so excuse me, please. But he actually, a lot of his films were adapted into movies in the 20s and 30s, but they stop pretty hard in the 30s. Like they never adapted anything after posthumously in the same way that like you're talking about, Fleming. So, they were popular enough to become films, I guess, but even Wells is like, this guy's going to be forgotten. They're never going to get reprinted. We're here to tell you, buy his books right now. I want to see a trend on eBay. I want to see a trend on Amazon.
Yeah.
Let's do it, people. We have the power.
We can bring this guy back. That Orson said was going to be just gone and forgotten. So
yeah, it's true. That's not. I think Wells's opinion matters a little bit more than ours in this sense.
Yeah.
He did a little bit more for popular culture, than we did. But he said, "Don't bother." We're saying, "Do it hard. Let's make his estate rich again."
Who knows? There might be a buried classic in one of these books if you read enough of his books. So there's something there, I'm sure. Anything else we got for this one? Are we good?
No, as I said, I appreciate that Orson doesn't follow the same pattern every week. He's always saying something different to keep us interested. So.
Always interesting, for sure. Well, enjoy this one, and we'll see you folks next time for more Orson commentaries and our commentaries on the commentaries. Thanks, guys.